Hey everyone, welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church. And today we're going to be in Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 13. And here, this one was talking about God's discipline proves his love. And we'll look at this and something that we need to look at as, sometimes we see discipline as a bad thing, and it's a good thing when done correctly. And so that's what we're going to look at today. So Hebrews 12, 1 through 13. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up, and let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. Think of all the hostility he endured from sinful people. Then you won't become weary and give up. After all, you have not yet given your lives in your struggle against sin. And have you forgotten the encouraging words God spoke to you as his children? He said, "My children, don't make light of the Lord's discipline, and don't give up when he corrects you. For all the Lord's discipline, for the Lord disciplines those he loves, and he punishes each one he accepts as his children. As you endure this divine discipline, remember that God is treating you as his own children. Who ever heard of a child who is never disciplined by its father? If God doesn't discipline you as he does all of his children, it means that you are illegitimate and are not really his children at all." And that's a good point. We're going to talk about that. Since we respected our earthly fathers who disciplined us, shouldn't we submit even more to the discipline of the Father of our spirits and live forever? For our earthly fathers disciplined us for a few years, doing the best they knew how, but God's discipline is always good for us so that we might share in his holiness. No discipline is enjoyable while it's happening, it's painful, but afterward there will be a peaceful harvest of right living for those who are trained in this way. So take a new grip with your tired hand and strengthen your weak knees. Mark out a straight path for your feet so that those who are weak and lame will not fall but become strong. And so the idea here, and the author, right, he challenges his hearers to endure, right, following Jesus, who is the supreme example of faithfulness, by imitating him in his suffering, right, and by enduring in God's discipline, and by living in peace with each other, which we'll see, we'll look at a little bit tomorrow. And so the idea here is that Jesus is the supreme example of faithful endurance, right? Our endurance in the Christian life, right, will depend on our keeping our eyes on Jesus. If we're going to be like him, then we keep our eyes on him, then we're going to be able to endure, staying focused on him and his work on our behalf. And so that's the idea here is, focus on Christ and you'll be able to endure it through the struggles and the stuff that they were going through. And so he reminds them, he says, think of all the hostility he endured from sinful people. And so, right, I mean, look at what happened to Christ. Obviously, he was put on a cross, crucified, and killed, but he was constantly being, people were constantly hostile toward him and going after him and stuff like that. And he's like, look, right, he went through this, and so the people that are this letter is to, right? They had become weary and were about to give up because they were going through a lot, and that's understandable from a human standpoint. It's understandable. They were emotionally fatigued, right? And because of the persecution they were facing. And so the key to their endurance was to focus on Christ. Like, yes, we know you're tired, we know you want to give up, but you need to focus on Christ. And so who had been through even worse hostility. Say, look, Christ's been through worse. And so, we need to remain faithful, stay steadfast in this race that we're running. And so he then transitions and talks about being disciplined, a child being disciplined by his father, and us being disciplined. And so, fathers in the Greco-Roman world, as well as in the Jewish families, right, were involved in the day-to-day aspects of raising their children, especially discipline. Right, discipline was seen as as necessary, something we probably need to bring back into society today. But lack of discipline, right? But discipline was seen as healthy and important, and an important component of preparing a child for adulthood. And unfortunately, we see this a lot today, where there's a complete and total lack of discipline. And so when children start to get closer to adulthood or get into adulthood, they don't know how to behave in society. They don't know how to act in society. They can't keep jobs. They can't work with people. They, end up getting arrested all the time because they think they can just do whatever they want. And so, um, a lack of fatherly discipline, right? And this is the example that's used here, and I think it's a good example for today, right? was considered, in this case, would have been a lack of any type of hardship in life. And it was actually a mark of illegitimacy, right? Not being disciplined was actually, especially in this time, in this day, and I think it's a sign today, right? Of a child being illegitimate. It's like your parents don't care for you, right? If they don't discipline in you, then they don't care for you. They love you. That wasn't seen as a blessing. And so going through not a lack of hard times, a lack of struggle, a lack of any sort of discipline back then, you was like, okay, well, no one really cares for this child, and it should be the same way today. It should be, there should be a fine, well, I say a fine line, but a pattern of discipline and sometimes hardship for people, for children, for this, and I'm not saying purposeful like hardship, like, oh, I'm going to just make this hard for you on purpose. It's or being abusive. That's not what we're talking about here. It's when a child or someone steps out of line, there's a discipline, there's consequences to actions, there's all these things, and that makes for a better person. That makes for a better character. All those things you learn from that. And so, he goes on to talk about the fatherly discipline here and how there's two limitations on our earthly fathers. Let me say one, his discipline or education is only for a few years. Obviously children should and do eventually leave the home. Second, earthly fathers were doing their best, right? They knew the best they knew how. From their limited perspectives, right? We're humans. We're not perfect. We're not going to be perfect fathers. And so the author reinstates that, hey, we're doing our best. We only have our children for a few years, and we do our best, right? But then he transitions, by contrast, to God's discipline, which lasts throughout our entire lives and is always good for us, right? We may discipline in error or something like that. We may not do it right, and it could be bad. Like what we do, we're not going to be perfect in that. But what the author is saying is God's discipline is always good for us. It's perfect. It's always what we need, and it's based on his unlimited knowledge and love. And so his goal is that we might, and because of that, the reason he disciplined us, or the reason there's consequences for our actions, especially those who he loves, is because, the goal is that we might share in his holiness. And that's what he wants. He wants us to be there for him. And so although it's painful, discipline brings about a peaceful harvest of right living, right? And you can tell, you can watch people just from a human perspective. You can watch and see kids who have been disciplined, and you can watch and see kids who have not been disciplined. And there's a night and day difference, right? And so this is why this is important. And so it in the end, it brings God's children into a state of harmony, right? Into a harmonious relationship with Him by doing what it's right. And so that was the encouragement. It's like, hey, yes, sometimes sometimes we go through persecution just because we're followers of Christ. That's going to happen, right? But sometimes we're disciplined because of the things we do and because of our sinfulness. And that discipline's good for us because it corrects us. It steers us, keeps us right with God, keeps us where we're supposed to be. And so that's the encouragement that we have here. So, as always, I hope you get something from this. I hope you learn from it. I encourage you, if you haven't, to subscribe to the channel. That way you can continue to follow along with us. And as always, I appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch these, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day.